Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. I'm Ray Gerard, and I am your host. Thank you for joining us. This is the program that raises the question, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here to write a letter specifically to America? What would he say? Well, we know exactly what he would say. He would say exactly what he said to the people 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean world. Why? Because what he wrote is timeless. His writings, like all scripture, express truths that do not change over time. And so here, what we do on this program is we look to one of St. Paul's writings and we try to apply them to a situation that we have in our culture today. Often, what we do is we do something that people say never to do, which is discuss two things at the same time, religion and politics. But as we do this, we always bear a certain motto in mind, which is love and kindness through the light of truth. And hopefully that is what we do here. Now, often what we do is we test St. Paul's writings with other writings, other authors, other things we find reliable, and ask the question whether or not these things are consistent. If they're consistent, if what St. Paul says is consistent with other things the church teaches, other things we find in the world through science or through ancient scholars, whatever, we'll tend to think that these things are more truthful. Also, usually what we do is we'll take a passage from St. Paul, some kind of medium-length passage, and we'll look for a number of different points. We'll look to draw out a number of different points in a particular passage. Now, today we're going to do something a little different. Today we're going to take a very short passage with two related ideas and see how many things that we can find that are consistent with what he says in this very short passage. And that passage is this. Comes out of his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4. He says, "The thief must no longer steal, but rather labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with one in need." The two ideas that we have here, private property and charity. It is not okay to steal, but any people should simply do honest labor with their own hands, and then once they do, look to give what they can to others in need. Private property and charity. Now, why do we call up this particular passage? Well, there is something that is very prevalent in our political society today, and that is this recently uncovered, no longer hidden idea of democratic socialism. A couple of years ago, we had a presidential candidate running on he ran in the Democratic primaries, but he has been regarded often enough as a democratic socialist, and he does not disown the term. Lately, we've had a new member of Congress from Brooklyn, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who also does anything but disown the label of democratic socialist as it's applied to her. And there are polls out, a number of polls that show scores of young people are beginning to believe in the concept of socialism. So since this is becoming a very relevant topic in our political discourse, the thought occurred, well, what if we looked at the principles of democratic socialism and ask, how do they comport with Catholic teaching? Are there inconsistencies or not? Now, you can easily think that democratic socialism is compatible with Christianity. All you have to do is look to the account given in the Acts of the Apostles of the early Christian community in Jerusalem, where people were living basically a communal lifestyle. All the property that people had in that community was sold, and everything was shared. The proceeds and everything was shared. It was a very communal lifestyle, and so you would say, well, that certainly is an example that we can look to. Also, people point to the Catholic worker movement of Dorothy Day in the 1930s, and say there's a lot of principles of that movement that are supported, and likewise support democratic socialism. So people can say, well, there's a lot of connection between socialism and Catholicism. For example, you might even look to the Gospel of Matthew, and there's the familiar account where a young man approaches Jesus, and he says, what must I do to attain the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus tells him, well, you must obey all the commandments. And Jesus relates several of the commandments. And the young man says, well, yes, I've done all that. I've obeyed all the commandments. And he says, is there anything else that I need to do? And Jesus says, well, if you want to be perfect, you have to go and sell everything you have and give the proceeds to charity. And as I'm sure anyone who's heard that story will remember, the young man went away very sad because he had many possessions. And then Jesus said, well, it is so much harder for anybody who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And all that is well known and famous. But then also, what follows next in that account of the gospel is this. I forget which one of the apostles, but one of them asked, but then how is it possible for anyone to enter the kingdom of heaven? Or perhaps paraphrased, how is it possible for many, any kind of a good number, to enter the kingdom of heaven? And it's a reasonable question. If you have to sell everything you own in order to achieve salvation, well then, in order for everybody to achieve it, then everybody has to sell everything. And if everybody's selling everything they own, who's going to buy? So it presents a situation that is not what you might say practicable on a society-wide basis. But what does Jesus say? Well, then he says, yes, I understand, but while all things are not possible with man, all things are possible with God. So it's still possible to achieve salvation, presumably if you obey all the commandments, but don't sell everything. So selling is not necessarily required. The exact phrase in the gospel is, well, if you want to be perfect, if you want to attain a high level of spirituality here on earth, if you want to be very saintly, well then sure, embrace poverty and so forth. But what about all the rest of us that don't? And Jesus says, well, it's still possible. But notice something else that he says. He says, go and sell everything you have. He doesn't say you must sell everything you have because it doesn't belong to you anyways. So he doesn't deny that this person owns things. He gives the young man, the choice. It is up to the free will of the young man as to which he values more, his material possessions, or Jesus. Because Jesus tells him, well, sell everything you have and come and join me, follow me. So he gives the man a choice. Now, why is that important? Well, besides the fact that we all can't live this perfect communal lifestyle, because as I say, then where would we find any buyers? The fact also is that if we want to try to achieve this very high level of sanctity, it has to be something we choose. If, for example, all that young man's property were simply taken away from him, would it go to his credit? If everything was taken away from him, sold, and then given to the poor forcibly, would it amount to that young man's credit? Would the people receiving the gift appreciate it at all? In other words, would there be any element of charity in this? And why is the element of charity so important? Well, because it's love. The word charity and love is sometimes used interchangeably in the religious context. When someone performs an act of charity, it's because he loves, and when someone receives an act of charity, they feel loved. And so they in turn may perform an act of love to somebody else. And that is, of course, what is prescribed in the Christian lifestyle, just simply to love your neighbor. In any event, so this whole idea of property, it was not denied as something that was valid by Jesus himself. So if property is possible, what about this whole idea of socialism? It is part and parcel of socialist teaching that property should belong to the state. Now, we trace these ideas back to Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and the early days of the communist movement. People might say, well, yes, but today, no one really believes such draconian things like all property must be given up. And the response to that is simply, oh, really? Why go through the process at all of engaging in democratic socialism? Is there not some type of an end goal? Are we to be told that, well, we'll just simply start down a road and we won't go all the way? And even if that's the case, when we start down this road, are there principles? Are there ideas? Are there philosophies that are underlying this path that we're taking that either make sense, that are either in harmony with the reality of the world as made by God or not? Why should the state have property? What does property do? Well, property affords you freedom. For example, if you have enough money for an airfare to an exotic tropical location, you can take a very nice vacation. If you don't, you can't. If you have the money for a car, you can drive yourself around. If not, you can't. If you have the money for a bus, you can take the bus. If not, you walk. Very elemental, very simple examples of freedom, but property does afford freedom in an earthly context. When you take away property, you are curtailing people's freedom. People will become beholden to the state. If, for example, what's common, what's being preached, for example, in the democratic socialist program today as we hear it being espoused? Well, number one, people are talking about, that we're going to have a minimum income for everybody. We're going to have free college. We're going to have free health care, but a minimum income. Everybody gets guaranteed a certain income. Well, if we're going to pay for all of those things, how much property has to be taken from people now? A very great deal. And so if at least most of people's property, at least 51%, 70%, 80%, how much property are we going to have to take from people in order to afford these things? But if we go back to, let's say it's 70% income tax rate or higher, for example, if we do, then we're going to be taking so much property away from people, and then they're going to be beholden to the state for their health care. Very important concern for every person. Your very life will depend on what the state says in terms of medical treatments that you're allowed to receive and not. Now, we're going to trust that the state is going to always exercise those privileges correctly, but it's going to be a bureaucracy. And how can we trust it? People fault capitalism because they say, well, you can't trust greedy corporations to give money back to their workers like they should. But where would you rather be, a worker negotiating with an employer or with a government which has no competition? In any event, so people will become beholden to the state. Freedom will. This is an opposition to personal freedom. If you're going to give the state that much property, then it's going to have a larger bureaucracy. It's going to necessitate a large bureaucracy to manage it. The state is going to just become a very large entity. And it is going to then wield more and more power to the loss of the individual. What else do we have here? Well, you can look to what's been called the law of nature. It's a very fundamental idea that there are things present on the earth, but that until man applies labor to it, a lot of the things we find on the earth are not going to do a lot for us. You may find berries growing in the field that you can use for food, but what about housing? You can maybe thatch a roof and build a log cabin for yourself, but you're not going to be having glass windows, air conditioning, and solar heating unless there's an awful lot of manufacturing, an awful lot of labor, an awful lot of capital that is applied to this endeavor. So things have to receive some input from man in order to make these things usable to us. Well, if certain people apply their labor or their capital to make these things available to us, are they not entitled to the fruits of what they apply to these efforts? Are they supposed to do all this simply for free, for no reason that helps them or helps their family? It is an elemental law of nature that if somebody, by his labor produces something, that he, more than other people, have the right to the fruits of that labor. Just as is the case that if somebody were to build something and you would just go over to him and take it, that'd be considered stealing, would it not? What's next? How about this concept of materialism? The socialist mindset is a materialist one. It looks to the state to provide housing, to provide education, to provide health care, to provide all the necessities of life. What cannot the state provide? Well, the state cannot provide your spiritual well-being, your spiritual welfare. But if the state becomes the focus of more and more things in a person's life, it becomes bigger and larger, then that's the focus that's given. The state doesn't even try to apply to the spirit, try to deal with the spiritual. In fact, going back to the very early origins of communism and socialism, it was stated by the founders of the movement that the two were opposed to each other. Why? Well, because if the state's going to wield all this power, it has to decide certain things. It has to decide what is valuable, what is important, what people are allowed to receive, and what they're not allowed to receive. If the state's going to do that, what if other people have some higher authority that they look to, that they can question the state, that they can object to what the state might be doing? If the idea behind socialism is that the state is everything, and therefore it cannot allow room for God. It cannot allow room for a morality, an objective morality based on a God, because it's going to be making decisions that might not comport with that. We think not. Well, How about abortion up until the very moment of birth? Nowadays, there are state legislatures, governors that are deciding this is a very good thing. And there are other people who are saying, wait a minute, that flies in the face of what we understand to be truths from God. The state would very much like, if the state had much more power than it has today, how well would those objections be heard or addressed? In any event, another principle of socialism, and why not look at these principles of socialism? People may say, well, but democratic socialism is a new modern concept, that it doesn't apply to, it doesn't relate to these old ideas, these original ways of thinking about it. Does it not? Oh, really? One principle from the beginning of socialism was called class warfare, pitting classes against classes. Do we have that? Have we seen that at all? Well, how many times have you heard in political campaigns that one party, the Republican Party, is for the rich, and all they want to do is help the rich? But what we need to do is we need to make the rich pay more. What's that all about? One class versus another class. Very simple. What does the Catholic Church teach? Catholic Church doesn't teach division. It teaches unity. That all people are a part of one larger family. It preaches the opposite. What about justice? So that's an idea everybody can agree on. However, are there different ideas of justice? Well, one idea of justice would be what I mentioned earlier, that if you produce something with your own labor, you're entitled to it. The socialist idea is that's not so. What about justice towards others? The socialist idea is we'll take care of that for you. The government, the state, will take care of that for you. What's the Christian? What is one of the most important Christian concepts in our faith system? Charity. Charity, love, giving to other people freely. Can you give if you don't even have? If there's nothing that you can say is mine, then how can you even give? And if you can't give, then there is no charity. There was a political writer named Saul Alinsky, prominent in the 1960s, wrote a significant book called Rules for Radicals, was accepted and regarded by many as the Bible of political activism. And he wrote that if you receive a gift of charity, it's meaningless. That what you need instead is to win something through a fight. That unless you earn something by fighting for it, it is meaningless. So the question easily is, well, what about love? Where is love? If the state provides everything, if there's no more charity, where is love? And again, that goes back to this idea of this materialist concept of things. The Catholic point of view is simply that, well, the material world is not that important. And as a matter of fact, if you are poor and receive a gift of charity, you're probably going to be better off than more rich people. Why did Jesus say, why did he make that camel going through the eye of a needle quote? A lot of times the poor are better off, but if they receive gifts of love, are they better spiritually? And spiritually meaning what? Spiritual in an eternal sense, for the salvation of their soul. How healthy will souls fare in a system where there is no charity? Is it possible that there could still be charity with socialism? Yes. But what we're talking about here are the underlying principles, the trends that would be put into place if you go down a socialist road. There are ideas behind everything. And if you are going to follow something, we better know what those ideas are. Let's look at a couple of other things. Order. How about this? The whole concept of social order. It was St. Thomas Aquinas who said that let me see if I find the quote here. He said, because there is more order in the management of men's affairs, if each has his own work of looking after definite things, whereas there would be confusion if everyone managed everything. More order. What does this call to mind? This calls to mind the principle of subsidiarity. It is an accepted, well-established principle in Catholic teaching. It's the principle of subsidiarity, that higher authorities shouldn't take on more power than they need to. That you should leave things that are capable, problems that are capable of being solved at lower levels should be solved at lower levels. Why? Goes back to this whole idea of freedom that we're talking about, freedom and personal responsibility. Why do we want people at smaller levels to handle these things? Because there's more personal interaction, because there's more responsibility. And what are we interested in there? We're interested in the development of the individual. We're interested in cultivating virtue. We're interested in cultivating morality. We're interested in cultivating compassion for other people. Why is that important? Because your soul is more important than whether or not you have a compact car or a full-size car. What else? How about incentives? Aquinas spoke to that as well. He basically said that everyone is more zealous in looking after a thing that belongs to him than a thing that is the common property. Do we have a case in point of this? You look at the old Soviet Union, and the stories were rampant of people not working hard, not being creative. They were not incentivized to work. And if you have this whole idea of private property, if everything is not held in common, then people will be spurred to work more. The concept behind behind democratic socialism is a worldview that is essentially upside down. It is a situation where the state precedes man, men and women. Men and women exist to serve the state. The state is more important. The individual man and woman serve the state, which then looks after the common good of everybody. What's the opposite view? The opposite view is the state exists for its individual citizens. The citizens are important. That's why our Constitution begins, we the people, not we the state, it's we the people. But why would some people want a situation where people belong to the state or serve the state rather than vice versa? Often enough, it's because people think that a lot of people in our society make bad decisions. They're too greedy. They spend too much money on themselves, and there are too many poor people that don't have enough. They drink too much, sugar-laced sodas. We have sodas, for example, in New York City trying to be regulated. They drive gas-guzzling SUVs. They smoke cigarettes when they should not. Some people don't agree with abortion, or some people don't want transgender education in kindergarten and early grade school years. People make decisions that we don't agree with, so we need to control them. That is what's being talked about. We need to control other people. And why is that? There could be a number of reasons. People could be unhappy with themselves because if you're happy with yourself, if you're at peace with yourself, if you're at peace with your community and the world around you, you don't want to control other people. All you have to do is look to the family situation. What is a sign of good parenting? A sign of good parenting is when a child is ready to leave, you let them leave and leave the home, lead their own lives. You don't become possessive. You don't become overly possessive. What's the opposite of that? You do try to control the children. Why would someone, even if it's hard, even if a child is making a decision a parent thinks is wrong, why would a parent nevertheless let the child find its own way in life? Well, it would be hard, but because of love. It would be because of love. Because love respects the freedom of the child. Love understands that the child has a dignity. They are a creation of God, a creature of God, just the same as the parent is. And it's a recognition of that. It's a love of that person that keeps a parent, a good parent, from being possessive. When you control somebody, when you try to curtail their freedom, that's the opposite. What else? In 2006, for example, here's a curious thing. Pope Benedict XVI wrote that he wrote of a peculiar he called it a quote peculiar Western self-hatred, close quote, and that we have quote lost all capacity for self-love, close quote. Self-hatred and a loss of self-love. Well, that strikes me as odd, because the humanism behind democratic socialism says that we are capable of controlling our lives, that we are capable of deciding what is moral. We are capable of deciding the values for our society. We're capable of controlling our environment. We can say that breast cancer is unacceptable, for example. We can believe that through technology, if not now, then soon enough, we're going to control everything there is around us. We believe that as humans, we have all of this power, and at the same time, we're expressing all of this love for ourselves. Pope Benedict XVI was talking about the fact that we've got this peculiar Western self-hatred. Where do we see that? What's he talking about? Well, for example, we see it when we, for example, in America, deny any kind of American culture. We will say that people emigrating to this country do not have to assimilate. They do not have to learn English. We need to learn their language. They don't need necessarily to learn that much about, the Bill of Rights and these types of things. So we could have, we could have all sorts of things along these lines. We blame America for a lot of things. Instead of defending this country, there are a lot of people who think that America is to blame for a lot of the problems in the world. They will say, for example, that the 9/11 destruction of the Twin Towers in New York City, that the destruction of those towers was our fault, that we antagonized certain peoples around the world, and that it is our fault. There are people who will blame America first for things. Why would we do this? It's a curious paradox that at the same time our society is expressing such a love for itself that we're also expressing a good deal of hatred for ourselves. Why is that? Is it perhaps that there is something amiss, that we sense somehow inside there is something amiss with what we're doing when we push forward with humanism, when we push forward with a situation where we elevate ourselves and push God out of the public sphere, that we're doing something which is against the harmony that exists in reality? Do we sense that somehow? Are we somehow conflicted? I'll leave that for you to think about. What else do we have? Well, we talked about the worldview. How about the view of the family? The view of the family. It was stated in the Communist Manifesto, and again, these are the underlying principles that socialism is based on. Catholic teaching, people will argue with certain Catholic teachings and so forth, and when they do, the Catholic Church will point to the foundations and the reasons, for why the Church believes what it believes, and will look to have teachings in one area consistent with a belief in another area. These ideas don't exist in a vacuum, And when we look to the Communist Manifesto, for example, it's because these are the ideas on which socialism is based. As a matter of fact, all we've known in the world in terms of countries that have tried this, have tried communism, is not communism, it's socialism. Communism is a higher state that so far no country has really achieved. So far, all they've achieved are different forms of socialism. So going back to that manifesto, what does it say about family? Besides saying that God and communism, God and socialism can't coexist, it also says that the family and socialism can't coexist. Why? Because the family depends on ownership of property. If we remove property, there will be no family. The USSR delegate to the League of Nations, was of course the predecessor to the United Nations, he talked about the glass of water theory with regard to love and the family. And what he said was, love and the family is like a glass of water. You drink the water, and when the water's gone, you dispose of the glass. It's the same with, a husband or wife, a sexual partner. You dispose of them after you're done with the sexual act. Children belong to the state. The USSR Matrimonial Code of 1918 and 1927 said children belong to the state. The Family Code of 1918 said that all marriages were invalid. And with the destruction of family and marriage, abortions became very prominent. In 1934, in Moscow, there were 57,000 live births. There were also 154,000 abortions, 3-to-1, a 3-to-1 ratio. In 1947, Bishop Fulton Sheen said that in a family, a person has value because he or she is. You love a person in your family because he or she is. Nothing else is required. Where else do we get that? Are you going to get that in a socialist state? A person is respected and loved because they are. That's all. It's unconditional in a way. It mirrors the love of God. But we're seeing something different in our culture today. Now, people may say, well, you can't look to the Communist Manifesto. These are old ideas. These underlying principles that you're talking about, they're really not going to be put in practice now. That democratic socialism, as it would be enacted nowadays, would be something very different. But do we not see the trends that we're talking about? For example, in the United Kingdom, parents wanted the freedom to take their child at no cost to the government to another country for medical care. The state, the government of the United Kingdom said, you don't have the right to do that. And your child must die. Our doctors have determined that Charlie Gard has no reasonable likelihood of recovery, so he must die. What is the rationale for that? And does that not strike at the very heart of the family? Does that not elevate the state, the government, over parents and children, over the family, the institution of the family? Does that not interject the state right into the midst of a most intensely emotional situation in a family? Does it not replace the values, the morality of the state for the morality and the freedom that the people in this family wanted to exercise? Well, past the family, how about the individual? What about the human condition? What about on the level of a particular individual? Well, for those who believe in the soul, for those who believe in God, the human person is a curious thing. We have a body and we have a soul. We have two parts. St. Paul talked about that when he said, when he talked about the difference between the flesh and the spirit. We have a body and a soul. That corresponds, in a way, to property and prayer. We use property to take care of the body. We use prayer to take care of the soul. It's a balance. It's a balance in this earthly life. But in the socialist system, what do they say? They said, well, there will be no property. And they give you a promise instead. You know, when we have property that we use to satisfy our daily needs, and we pray for the promise of something better in the life to come. Socialism, by contrast, gives us no property, and they give us a promise that we can hope, a promise and a hope in something better in terms of the material things that they will give us, but they promise nothing for the next life. They take away the property, but they can't supply a promise or hope for us. What about the whole concept of equality? I mean, each person, it's an earmark of democratic socialism that people should be equal, that everybody should be put on a level playing field. Not only on a level playing field, but that everybody gets what the state allows, so that everybody is treated equally. What about a Catholic perspective? A Catholic perspective would respect the idea that each person is different. Each person is very special in the sight of God. Each is different. We're not like blades of grass that when you look at them, they'll look the same. We're not like rows of corn where you have corn stalk upon corn stalk and you can't tell the difference, or a herd of cows or a herd of horses. No, people are very different. Would you be happy if you lived in a subdivision where all the houses were the same, except for maybe the color of the garage doors being different? No. We're all very different. We're all special. We all have certain gifts. We're given gifts of the Holy Spirit. We all have certain special talents. But if the state controls everything, where is the room for that to be expressed? Where is the room for that to grow and to live? This is why the underlying principles, the philosophy of democratic socialism, have numerous areas where it just simply does not comply with the idea and the reality of the human person. Because first and foremost, it says nothing about it. It doesn't even acknowledge the need to address the relationship of an individual to God. If a state is going to take over so many features of individual lives, then it has to understand and acknowledge, address, and deal with our real, true natures, that we are creatures of God, and it has to deal with that in our relations with one another. But if it doesn't even acknowledge that at all, then how can it manage our affairs at all appropriately? I haven't even mentioned this yet. Excuse me. The 10th commandment. The 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. What is socialism? If it is not people in a bureaucracy deciding to take away certain goods from certain people, if it is not a majority just coveting, it is a system where we're going to teach people to covet things that belong to other people. We're going to have incessant arguments about what is too much for somebody to have. We're going to breed an entire culture of coveting. The 10th commandment was called a commandment for a reason. If anybody is looking to the idea as to whether or not socialism complies and is consistent and can be accepted while at the same time practicing Catholicism, where and how do we account for the 10th commandment? Next, how about another Christian concept? Peace. Peace. Where is peace in this? It's in very short supply. Socialists around the world have often agitated. The USSR was born by revolution. The Castro government or regime in Cuba was born the same way. That is how the socialist government in Venezuela is now holding on to power by force. People are agitated. Violence is used. Class warfare is preached. Envy between classes of people is preached and practiced. There is turmoil that is stirred up. It is nothing along the lines of peace. Christ preached preached that people should detach themselves from the material world. These things are not important. Instead, the socialist mindset will have people thinking about them all the time, putting their souls into a certain amount of turmoil while they're considering and arguing about what somebody should have, what should be taken from somebody else, what I should be allowed to keep. Peace is not something that is being promoted. Peace is not promoted. The family is not promoted. The soul, the recognition for the soul is not promoted. Freedom is not promoted. If this was a list, if you had a legal pad, and you were to put on one side of the paper all the things where it was where democratic socialism was consistent with Christianity, and then the other side of the paper you put all those things where it wasn't, then maybe we could have a discussion. What I'd like to find out is if anybody can show me where you can put the things on the side of the paper that says they're consistent. If we go down the major features of what it means to be Christian, freedom, free will. Free will is, I don't know what you can say is most important. If anything is more important than anything else. But freedom is right there at the top of the list. It's the reason why people are created. It's the reason why we exist. We exist in order to love those around us and love God. Love means nothing. It is nothing unless it's a free act, unless it's a voluntary act, unless somebody decides to do it. That's why the gift of free will was so immensely huge. If you have a system that even to some degree tries to impinge on personal freedom, take away personal freedom, make people feel more like they're automatons. Did you ever read George Orwell's 1984? Make people feel more like machines than human. If it does that to any degree, then how is that consistent with Christianity? Charity, love, the family, love. If free will wasn't enough, how about love? Well, we're carrying this too far. People can still love. People can love in a socialist system. There's no problem with that. Really. Why is it that the U.S. has started out with saying there was no room for love? You can get a divorce on a postcard. And that was actually what was the law at that time. The theory of a glass of water that I described. This is what people who ascribe to this theory believed. Abortion's up, families down, children belong to the state. Have we heard that in the U.S.? Where people talk about, it takes a village, and schools have the right to decide how children should be educated, even against the wishes of parents. There are, like I said, if it was 10 items on one side, 11 items on the other side, we could have a discussion. But where these core principles of Christianity are questioned and attacked and opposed, and if I haven't mentioned it, what about simply the belief in God? Socialism believes in atheism. We see this all the time. We can't have We can't have God in our schools. We can't have Christmas displays in public. There are so many other religions that are allowed to complain if they're discriminated against. But if you're a Christian, if there's a work of art that blasphemes the image of Christ, that's okay. There are so many ways now where we see this being played out. And this is before we have even voted on or accepted democratic socialism in any overt way. What would it be like if we do? There was a gentleman, he was named of William Barrett, professor of philosophy at New York University. In 1978, he was a participant in a symposium, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And here's what he said. I grew up a Marxist and a socialist, and a good many people of my generation, from Marxism in its more or less standard and simple form, I retreated to something more theoretical and complex, which might be called, for lack of any other name, liberal Marxism, until at long last it became quite clear that these two were incompatible notions. The final stage in that particular development was a residual belief in democratic socialism, which seemed so reasonable and encompassing an ideal that one's spirit might hope to find permanent rest there. I now perceive that this was the underlying illusion that fathered all the others. And indeed, now that I am quit of it, what strikes me as strange is why I should have held on so long and tenaciously to this faith in, quote, democratic socialism, quote, quote. How could we ever have believed that you could deprive human beings of that fundamental right to initiate and engage in their own economic activity without putting every other human right in jeopardy? A great deal of antagonism towards capitalism historically has come out of the unrecognized need to satisfy other and more obscure gropings. I think I can say with some degree of assurance of every intellectual I have known personally who was a committed socialist, that the socialist ideal represented a displacement of moral and religious values which had not found their outlet elsewhere, and here came to distorted expression. Was not the socialist position as invulnerable as any religious overbelief? You do not have to defend the imperfections of any existing regime. As one more intolerable socialism after another came into existence, you could simply shrug each off as not being real socialism. You had your justification and your redemption thus in another world, that world of the future beyond any realized fact. As for the gritty personal problem of finding a meaning of one's own life in the face of death, that too was something to be left to the future, the truly humane future of socialism, when mankind would discover the real meaning of its existence. Socialism, as this man understood it in 1978, from all the people that he was acquainted with, was a quest into the unknown. They did not know where they're going, and the socialists of today may know no more. We'll find out when we get there. Well, we already know the meaning. We already know where we're going. We already know where we're supposed to go. We're supposed to go back home because there is a God, because he knew us before we were born, because he loved us before we were born, and we're going to go back there. We'll go back to be with him if we follow Christ as we've been told to. We don't need to make this up on our own. We don't need to discover a world and a path that is unknown. It is known. It was laid out to us. The hope in eternal life is something that is beyond socialism. If you are going to have a society that takes care of all people, how can it begin to do that unless it understands this about people, unless it respects it? Socialism will be a situation where people's beliefs, religious beliefs, are going to be curtailed more and more. It has happened every time it's been tried. We see it over and over again. We see it even in the U.S. So, do you want to persist in some belief in democratic socialism? If so, perhaps you can come up with a way that will make it make sense, that will alleviate the problems that can be encountered. But you will have to answer some of these questions, basic questions, questions of freedom, questions of objective morality that come from God, questions of charity and love, questions of a belief in the afterlife, these questions. Like I said, this is a program where we talk about religion and politics, and sometimes it may get disagreeable, but it is something that we need to talk about. The popes, many of these things that I've talked about were laid out in a document called Rerum Novarum, which was issued by Pope Leo XIII back in 1891. And he mentions so many of the things we've talked about. 40 years after, there was another encyclical that reiterated all of the things Pope Leo had said. Then on its 100th anniversary in 1991, Pope John Paul II issued an encyclical Centissimus Annus, which did the same thing. There were popes throughout the 1700s and 1800s who were talking about some of these same ideas. From the 1850s forward, just about every pope there is has come out against socialism, Catholicism, and socialism. Can it work? Catholicism has always, always, always been for the poor. What it is not for is taking property away from people, creating a large bureaucratic state that will impinge on their free will, create a barrier between them, an obstacle between them and God, create fewer avenues for people to express love. That is not what it will be for. That small little 2-line passage that we had from St. Paul at the beginning, and I'll repeat it now. The thief must no longer steal, but rather labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with one in need. A gift, like salvation itself, a gift from God. This basic understanding of the human condition can be found in just these simple 2 lines from St. Paul. And it's a message that America needs to hear today, like so many other messages in his letters. We hope that this has been somewhat enjoyable. We hope you'll join us again. Until then, God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.